This is Owen Gaines, aka Q-Tip with QTipPoker.com. In this video, we'll be going over Poker Postflop Course Part 1, The River. This is Episode 1, which covers pages 1 through 45. The reason I'm going over this material, one, I'd like to facilitate discussion about river play in general in my forums, and also to prompt discussion for those who already have the book with questions and comments. I'd also like to provide information about the book's contents to those considering buying Poker's Postflop course. Now, this video series won't go into as much detail as the book does, but we will touch on the major concepts. So let's go ahead and get started. First of all, the book's divided into two sections. The first one's check or bet. The second one is raise, call, or fold. And the check or bet section is divided into being in position and out of position. When we look at the check or bet decision when we're in position, I use a teeter-totter illustration when we're weighing these decisions to determine which decision to make, and we make this decision based on the expectation value of each choice. So if the expectation value is worth more money for betting, this side of the teeter-totter would go down, and vice versa. If checking has a higher expectation value, this side of the teeter-totter goes down, and we make whichever decision is lower to the ground. And some decisions, one side is just buried in the ground. We have a very easy choice. Other decisions are much like this illustration here, where each option has an EV very close to the other one, and the decision is just quite close. But the entire decision process is based off of expectation value. The flow of thinking I use in the book to make this decision is: step one, do I have a profitable value bet? And what size is most profitable? 2, do I have a profitable bluff? What size is most profitable? 3, do I have a profitable inducing bet? 4, if the answers to more than one of the above questions are yes, which is most profitable? And 5, if none of the answers to questions 1, 2, or 3 is yes, then we check. In episode 1 here, we'll simply be covering, do I have a profitable value bet, and what size is most profitable? First, we talk about checking. Checking is a last option, and we concede there's no other decision that has more value. And checking when we're in position is very simple. Basically, the EV of checking is the pot times our equity. And very simply, who cares? We use checking as a base to analyze other options, and we'll go through that in a moment. But that's the first thing I talk about in the book is when we're in position, what's the value of checking? What do we gain by checking? And it's simply our equity times the pot. And now we move on to the value betting section. And I define a value bet in the book as when we make a bet and villain calls with more worse hands than better hands. In other words, we have more than 50% equity versus his calling range. To analyze just how good a value bet is, I used two things. One is evaluative EV and the other is true EV. Understanding expectation value in the poker world, there's some terms that go around, some different equations people use that can cause some confusion. I talk about the difference between evaluative EV and true EV a bit in Poker Math That Matters, but I covered in much more detail here in this book. But basically, evaluative EV compares one option to another, whereas true EV just says how much richer or poor will I be after I make a wager. I like to use evaluative EV when I'm analyzing decisions because really when it comes down to it, making a decision in poker is comparing two or more options and deciding which one is the better or the best option. And so we could create an equation to come up with the expectation of a value bet and say, well, it's $10. Well, who cares? We don't really care about the fact that the true EV of a value bet is $10. What we want to know when we're checked to on the river in position is the value bet better than a check? And so what we would need to know is $10 better than the EV of checking. So if the EV of checking is less than $10, we would know that we want to go ahead and choose the option of a value bet. Well, evaluative EV takes care of that in one step. I introduce a concept in the book called truncation. And truncation is the impact of an inactive range. And when we talk about an inactive range, I mean a part of the villain's range that when we bet, he simply folds those hands. And as villain's inactive range increases, the difference between a bet and a check decreases. And what we mean there is that when we say villain's inactive range increases, we're saying the more that we bet and the larger portion of the villain's range that just simply folds, then the difference between a bet and a check decreases. An EEV equation typically uses a truncated range. I talk about the impact of that in the book and what you need to watch out for when you're making calculations. Here's a figure from the book that shows value bets and the evaluative expectation value of value bets. This is based on our value bet sizes here on the right. That is distinguished by color. And then on the bottom, we're looking at the percentage of worse hands calling in the villain's calling range. So here at the 80%, we can see that villain's calling range has 80% worse hands in it. You can see they all cross this zero expectation value here at 50%, where he has same amount of worse hands as better hands. Those is the same as checking. In other words, the evaluative expectation value of a value bet is neutral. And as we move to the right, where the villain has more worse than better hands in his calling range, our EEV increases, both with his worse hand calling percentage as well as the size of our bet. Those are plus EV bets, and then of course to the left we have negative EV bets, where the villain has more better hands in his range than worse hands. Now if we introduce this chart to the left is the one we were just looking at. This one to the right is introducing the truncation concept. And what I've done here is we've truncated the opponent's calling range by 80%. In other words, we make a value bet. The opponent simply folds 80% of his range. He calls with 20% of his range. And inside that 20% calling range, we have different portions of better to worse hands. So you can see the impact truncation has, where that $160 value bet, where the opponent always had worse hands, where it looked extremely valuable here. Now it still has value, but its value is around the $30 mark instead of the $160 mark. So truncation brings decisions much closer to checking. As we said, the larger the opponent's inactive range, then the difference between betting and checking decreases. And the impact of truncation, it can actually impact us heavily enough, introduced with some other concepts, to turn what looks like a value bet into a check. We'll get there later. And now we introduce the concept of our bet sizing. Part of the beauty of No Limit Hold'em is we have options to min bet all the way to an all-in. And typically, as we increase the size of our bet, the opponent's calling range decreases. So if we make a $20 bet into a $40 pot, the opponent may call with quite a few hands. But if we make a $200 bet into that $40 pot, then the opponent may call with very few hands. And this is the way the opponent's calling range typically responds to our bet sizing. There are times when the opposite is even true, where the larger we bet, sometimes the opponent may interpret that as a weaker range, and his calling range may stay the same or even get larger. But for the most part, this is how people's calling ranges respond to the size of our bet. As we think about our bet sizing and how the opponent responds, we want to think about what size bet is best, or what size bet has the highest EV. We begin by looking at situations where we hold the nuts or the effective nuts. In other words, the opponent has no better hands than we have. And this table shows bet sizes and percentage of the opponent's calling range that have all the same EEV of $20. Here we bet $20. The opponent calls with this entire range, and obviously that has an EV of $20. We increase our bet size to $40. The opponent cuts his calling range in half, and this is the point where we again have an EEV of $20. So all these bet sizes and portions of the opponent's range that he calls with produce an EV of $20. And you can see how this graphs this out and shows something of a flattening effect. And basically what we learn is that we have a doubling effect when we hold the nuts. Whereas if you wanted to determine if a $40 bet or an $80 bet was a better bet, which of these two is better, you say, well, if I bet $40, my opponent will call with some portion of his range. If I increase my bet size to $80, as long as he doesn't cut his calling range in half compared to the $40 bet, then this $80 bet is going to be better. If he removes more than 50% of his calling range, we'd be better off with the smaller bet. This makes for pretty easy analysis of different bet sizes when we hold the nuts or the effective nuts, but unfortunately, we don't often have the luxury of always holding the best hand. So this moves into a much more complicated situation where we don't hold the nuts. And I introduce a concept called an X worse. And this is basically another way to think about equity. The cool thing on the river is we don't have any cards to come. So The percentage of the opponent's worst hands in his range is exactly what our equity would be. So for example, we'll take 2x. 2x worse hands in the opponent's range. In this case, in the opponent's calling range. And this would be if the opponent, say, had 10 combinations of better hands, then he would have 2 times that, 2x worse, 20 combinations of worse hands in his calling range. That would be a total of 30 combinations, 10 of which are better, 20 are worse. And that's what we mean by a 2x worse. And that simply is a 66.6% equity. It means we have 66% equity against that range. 3x has 3 times worse, 75% equity, and so forth. So I have an appendix on thinking about x worse, and it's something that simplifies concepts for me throughout this book. And you can still think about this in terms of equity if you wish, whichever is easiest for you. But this table shows us how aggressively or how cautious we must be as we increase our bet sizes. The tables here contain multipliers of an initial bet size based on the opponent reducing the worst hands in his calling range. So for example, if we have the opponent's calling range as 10x worst hands, and we increase our bet size times 3, then the opponent can reduce his worst hands in his calling range by 60% and will have a same EV. If it reduces his calling range by less than 60%, the larger bet's going to be better. If it reduces his worst hands in his calling range by more than 60%, the smaller bet would be better. And so we can use this table. There's a graph to show this as well in the book as we compare bet sizes. But as the opponent's x worst gets larger and larger, we approach that doubling effect we had when we held the nuts. And as his x worst gets smaller and smaller, we approach a break-even point, which would be a 1x, where the opponent has the same number of worse hands and better hands. We have to be much more cautious as we increase our bet size. So we can see here, and when we have 1.5x, worse, this is 60% equity against the opponent's calling range, we make an initial bet size. If we increase our bet size so much that the opponent reduced his calling range only by 30%, we actually have to get 10 times more money to have the same EV of the smaller bet size. I wrap up sizing by looking at, we won't be able to get all the details here in this small version of the graph, by looking at different x worst, 1.5, 2x, 3x, and then different range shapes, strong ranges, bell ranges, flat ranges, weak ranges, and seeing how, given different assumptions of the opponent removing worse hands from his calling range, how those EVs are impacted at different x worsts versus different range shapes. So that'll take you on through to page 45 in the book. Also included inside those pages at the end, there's an EEV shortcut for value betting. I think many of you will find very useful, where you can calculate EV in your head without using pen and paper or notepad, something like that. There are 18 test your comprehension questions and answers. And then there are 10 exercises that total about 100 questions and answers for you to sharpen your skills, to actually go in and put pen to paper and make sure that you have all these concepts down pat. In episode 2, we'll move on. We'll talk about bluffing. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions or comments on this section in the book, please make use of the Q-Tip Poker forums. Thanks for watching.